Should I do my dumb joke?
No. Welcome to the Hackaday podcast. My name is Mike Szczys. I'm editor-in-chief of Hackaday.
Hey, I'm Elliot Williams. I'm managing editor of Hackaday.
This is episode 147. Today we're talking about animating traces, sucking and climbing, spinning sails, and squashing images. Well, Elliot, should we talk a little Hackaday news with the Hackaday podcast listeners?
Let's break the news to them.
So I have decided to make a career move and accepted a role as a developer relations engineer at a company called Goliath IoT. And Elliot will be the next editor-in-chief of Hackaday.
Hooray!
Woohoo!
And good for you, Mike. I think it's really cool that you get to totally switch fields and pursue something else that's really interesting to you.
I'm not sure it's totally switching fields, but, I've always kind of wondered if I could cut it with like firmware. This company is focusing on cloud connectivity for firmware engineers, and the developer relations is kind of like you do some of that. So you're working with the platform, you're doing examples, you're writing documentation, you're writing content and making videos and probably going out and talking to people at companies and conferences and stuff. But to actually move towards that direction, I think is super exciting. And I couldn't say no. So I got to try it.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think when opportunity knocks, you got to open the door up, right?
You do. But for Hackaday, it means that next week we're going to hand the scepter over. Woohoo! And you're going to take the reins. And I think that's fantastic, Elliot. I wrote to the writing crew and I said that I think you're the best thing that's happened to Hackaday since I've been here. And I do think that's true. It makes me think back to that first time we met, maybe a week after you came on as a contributor, doing the workshops the day of the very first Hackaday Prize ceremony in 2014. And you walked in the door and I'm like, it's great you're here. Can you run this workshop that I never told you about?
Yeah, that was super fun. And I'm just like, sure, let's do it. It ended up being right up my alley, though. You handed me that one. It was no problem at all.
And a long and illustrious friendship happened. And, I think someone else, one of the writers wrote back and said, you have big shoes to fill. And I don't feel that way. I feel like all the shoes at Hackaday are filled by multiple people. And you've been wearing these shoes with me for a long time, and it's going to be great.
It's all of our writers and all of our contributors, but a steady hand at the helm cannot be underestimated. And I think we really have all appreciated that. Mike, you certainly love Hackaday as much as I do, and you've probably been reading Hackaday as long or maybe even longer than I have, and you've been here since forever. So it is kind of like, it feels like the end of an era in a way. But on the other hand, I'm going to keep Hackaday on the rails, keep everything running, and y'all keep the good hacks coming, and we'll just keep on keeping on.
I can't wait to show up at a SuperCon and not be working.
Oh, that is going to be interesting. Yeah, but then you could give a talk. You could come into the green room.
There you go.
The secret green room.
I'll volunteer. I'll be keeping the line calm and orderly or something like that.
Yeah, you get yourself a red shirt finally.
All right. Well, should we do a podcast?
Absolutely, let's.
Or should that just be it?
We got a couple more podcasts to do. We gotta savor them, man.
Oh yeah, we got to keep them going. All right. So the other big news this week is, of course, the return of the 555 timer contest, which I think is super cool. I looked it up. It's 10 years. It was
That's
2011
crazy.
when they did that. Do you remember that first one?
I do, of course. Do I remember what won, though? There was a giant, There was a processor or something made out of 555s, but that might have been the second one. Huh. Can you remember what won the first one?
I don't, but I remember just weeks and weeks of awesome write-ups of projects coming in, and I just loved it. So that was conceived of by Jerry Ellsworth, and then Chris Gamble got excited about it and helped bring it to life. And they did a great job of it. But this year, 2021, marks the 50th anniversary of the design. The chip itself was actually released in, the next year. But 50 years. So it seems like a great time to run it. DigiKey's partnering with us again on this. So the top 3 entries are each going to get a $150 shopping spree at the DigiKey warehouse. Build something using the 555 timer. if you can't find stock, because that seems to be an issue this year, just look at the schematic of the internals of the 555 and build a discrete something based on that, and just tell us the story of how you came up with it. But I think it's a fun time to get people who haven't used this chip before to do something, and to get the people who know all the ins and out of it to do something incredible.
Wait. Are you telling me that the global chip shortage has extended itself to 555 timers?
I don't know, but it
How
seems
low
like
is this going to go?
Yeah, like turtles all the way down.
Eventually it's going to be like there's no more sand on the beach. I mean, what else can we do here?
I think it's all you can get is tablets and smartphones. You can't get chips anymore.
The other thing I saw in the news this week was an article about Samsung bricking smart TVs. And this was because a bunch of smart TVs were stolen in a large batch in South Africa. Samsung's gonna go in there and find all the ones with the stolen serial numbers and just shut them straight down. On one side, this makes a lot of sense to kind of disincentivize the thieves from stealing them in the future. On the other hand, it scares the heck out of me as a consumer. And I have to think back to the FTDI debacle where they changed the Windows driver to be incompatible with counterfeit versions of their chips. And of course, probably the counterfeiters got hurt a little, but who got stung in the end was people who thought they were buying real FTDI chips.
Right.
And I have the same feeling with these Samsung TVs that innocent/unsuspecting people are going to be buying these TVs and then they're going to not work on them unless Samsung can do it real fast and get them shut down before the thieves can offload them, in which case that I guess would be the best of all possible worlds.
Oh, right, because you're saying they would be crippled after they were resold. It's a tough one on this. I don't think that it's good that they're shutting those TVs down. The more interesting thing about this is that people aren't thinking so much about all the snooping that's going on. Like when you watch a program on a smart TV, probably what you're watching is being sent back to a server somewhere, like being reported.
That's the business model.
You're never going to have your TV shut down. Like the odds of it are just so small, but you're definitely going to have someone looking over your shoulder at what you're watching.
They don't want you to shut your TV down. It's like the Matrix.
Yeah.
That would be like them cutting you out of the pod, right? You're providing the energy. So
where's my data? Oh no, the TV's been shut down.
Exactly. It did cross my mind that some black hat / I don't know, totally murky gray hat hacker could find out how Samsung's doing this bricking and repeat it on all of them. And that makes me think of this sort of mechanism as a real liability for Samsung. I mean, no one's done this to them yet, but can you imagine that everybody just bricks all of their TVs and then everybody with a legit Samsung TV calls up Samsung customer support? That would be a loud and clear message sent to Samsung, but it would also leave like millions of consumers in the lurch.
You've just jogged my memory back to that Blu-ray problem, and that was Samsung. Do you remember that?
Right.
Badly formatted XML file might have been responsible. So that there was like, it phones home looking for something at boot time, and then it wasn't getting it, so everyone's was bricked. And I think the news at the time was that people were going to have to send these things back to have them, unbricked. So like different problem, but a symptom of the same universe of trouble that we're in, right?
Yeah. Well, it's also hard to disentangle from just the universe where manufacturers can push firmware upgrades, because if you can push firmware upgrades, you can also push one that bricks the thing.
Right, of course.
And when it's an internet-connected device like this, it has to be able to receive upgrades, because then if it weren't, when they discover that there's a horrible flaw and it's being run in some zombie botnet, that doesn't make anybody happy either.
This is a journey into sound.
What's that sound?
What's that sound?
I totally picked a What's That Sound for you, Mike Stitch.
For me?
For you, Mike Stitch.
Oh, that was so nice. Well, let's hear it. Whoa. Oh, you did that just for me.
I did, actually. Do you have any idea what these sounds might
I love
be?
the last one. 8 seconds in is the perfect one.
I had fun with that.
Yes, I absolutely. Not only do I know what this is, but I could name each one of these sounds. The first one is the second one is coming after you, and they make that sound when they come down a step. The next one is about to explode,
Correct.
and then exploding, and then the cow. The cow is the best. I love the cow. Oh, too much. I played too much of that game, Elliot. I played 40,000 hours. I don't know. I played literally thousands of hours of that game in my time. And actually, we should talk about this next week. We launched the Hackaday prize with that game.
Yeah, right?
That?
I remember.
Yeah.
I do remember. Yeah. And I had never played it back then.
Yeah. So we'll have to talk about that next week. I'm sure you're going to cut all of this out. Ooh, hey, can I win a Hackaday podcast t-shirt after I leave?
That's what I was thinking. I'm like, you never get these. You need a Hackaday podcast t-shirt. So I say, no matter who else wins this one, Mike, get yourself a podcast t-shirt.
Should we get into the hacks?
Let's do.
Oh, I'm going down the rabbit hole on this one because it's a new YouTube channel. I'm going to have to watch everything now. Ryan Flowers picked up on this YouTube series from Chris Harbor, where Chris is like homesteading, but trying to be modern in some ways. So like there's electricity on the property, even though he's living in this house that's built out of like wood cutoffs and dirt. But the electricity is supplied by a battery backup fed by hydroelectric plant of his own production. He has a small stream running through his property, and about 7 months a year, the water is running fast enough for him to harness it and drive a generator. And this video kind of gives you the overview of the generator. There's also one that was posted, I think, like a week ago. This one's from a while ago, the overview is. There's one posted a week ago where he's replacing the 12 battery array. He'd like bought a used set, but new to him set of forklift batteries to power the house, and he gets like up to 500 watts out of this generator at peak. He can pretty reliably get about 375 or so, and this is what's actually going into the batteries, so that's after all the losses.
Oh, serious?
Yeah, fantastic.
Does he have a reservoir to go with it, or is he just pulling this off of a stream and hoping for the best?
Yep, just pulling off of the stream, so that's why it only runs, a little bit more than half the year. But he's got a solar array too, so I went and watched a little bit of the solar array one. The control of this is awesome. I mean, he's already elbow deep into these other types of energy with the solar array and everything. So he has a maximum power point tracker for this. He has automated valves that can increase or decrease the amount of flow that's going into it. So he can actually tune his hydroelectric so that it produces the peak amount of power.
My dad used to teach at a really weird college, Deep Springs, off in the middle of the mountains in California. And they're basically self-sufficient because they have a spring that's high enough up the mountain that it generates enough head to run a hydro plant for them. They generate AC with it, though. This guy's generating DC if he's charging batteries, I think. Because generating AC is a whole nother can of worms because you have to worry about the speed at which the thing's running, or else your clocks run too fast or whatever happens when you get 62 cycles per second.
It's cool, though, to see him talking. He's got a tablet interface for it, and he shows like the tracking per day on what he generated. And, he says right in there, I haven't been running it that much because I haven't been using enough power to need to recharge it. I'm like, that's the dream. Yeah.
I wonder what we have around here that I could tap into. Absolutely nothing. Solar,
bathtub
I think.
Drain.
yeah, right. All the water coming down from the third floor every time we flush up here in the attic office. All right, my first hack this week is kind of a sleeper. It's by Stacks, and it's called Watch Blender Plugin Make Animated PCB Traces and More. And if you watch these videos, and actually we threw in an animated GIF of this because it looked so cool, it makes this fantastic effect where the traces kind of grow all at once and shine out of a render of a PCB. Why would you do this? I think just because it looks super duper cool. But that's not actually the point here. The really neat thing about this for me was that it's a demonstration of how easy it is to do something with a little bit of Python and using Blender, which has a Python plugin interface, to make some phenomenal, professional looking, stunning, whatever, bespoke animations with just 100 lines of Python code. And it's not minimalist because he's pulling in big libraries. It's minimalist because Blender makes it very easy to integrate Python scripts in with their kind of otherwise drag and drop, connect lines together kind of workflow. And this is a really cool video for that. It really makes me want to go out there and just like start doing some Blender Python coding. I don't have any reason to, but now I have this like burning desire because of this. Literally, the libraries he imports are the Python standard math library, the Python Blender library for the, interfaces and the controls and stuff, and then HeapQ, which is a heap sorting library, does the sorting efficiently. The rest of it is actually all simple math, and it's all done for you. This is a fantastic example if you're interested in coding for graphics.
Well, and honestly, the electronics application of it is really one that you should look into and think about if you're doing any kind of like contract electronic design. You can have the world's most awesome circuit just working great. And if it's got like gnarly wires and like scary looking things all over it, getting the customer to sign off on it is going to be hard. Like the things, unfortunately, have to, like the prototype has to look good in order to get the wallet to open for these sorts of things. And so if you figure out how to do animation like this that shows off the circuit board that you laid out, like it's just a big, huge wow factor that makes people who are less technical when it comes to electronic design look at it and assume that you know what you're doing.
Absolutely. And if you actually like dig into the code here, you will know what you're doing because it's actually extraordinarily well written. Basically, it's like maze solving, right? It's how am I going to follow these copper traces and render them piece by piece by piece as they grow along? It's like roots growing into the circuit or something. And that's exactly the same way you'd go about solving mazes or planning robot motion. And in fact, he's using the A-star algorithm here with some slight tweaking for influence radius. Let's see, how to start. A-star is you basically give all of the free spaces a low point value and you give the barriers a very high point value. And then you go from start to finish counting up all of the points that every given path takes you to get there. And because the barriers have a value of like 1,000,000 and free spaces have a value of 1, it finds the shortest path through all of the free spaces. And the influence radius bit is just in there to undo the kind of taxicab metric that comes about from having everything be on a grid. So like, where you'd want to go diagonal, that should really count as 1.4 steps instead of 1 over and 1 down, 2 steps. Anyway, this video includes a great discussion of how the A-star algorithm works and how he put it to use here. And if you want to see another version of this, you should check out Nicholas Rame's Autonomous Drone Dodges Obstacles Without GPS, which came out just a few weeks ago. That was also an application of A-star, except this time to a drone navigating a course. The point is that this isn't just useful for making funny graphics, it's also useful for getting cars through places where they're blocked by things, or moving an arm through space without it hitting other things along the way, and all sorts of kind of general purpose motion planning stuff. And if that isn't good enough for you, I found a neat 5-year-old talk, 40-year-old arcade game reveals secrets of robot path planning, which talks about the potential field approach to path planning, which is like this, but with kind of directions as well. And it makes for a kind of smoother, maybe more optimum path. But that's kind of like the next level if you want to take this example and tweak it to make yourself a super fancy looking Python Blender video animation monster.
I've always been fascinated by the I guess, pop culture concept of climbing up the side of a building using suction cups, Elliot. Now,
Spider-Man.
Spider-Man, of course, but non radioactive spider bitten people could possibly climb up the side of the building if they just had the right kind of suction cups. And Elijah Sirioli decided to take this on and figure out if he could do it. He actually started in December of last year and built the proof of concept for these out of plywood. And it's just as simple as this. You have a flat plate made of something like plywood. You have a vacuum pump that has a hole through the plywood and onto the inside. And then you have silicone weather stripping around the outside of the plank. So you push it up against a wall, you flick on the vacuum pump, it sucks out all the air that's inside of the weather stripping, and then it's very difficult to pull that off of there. I was actually watching this, Elliot, and I was thinking to myself, isn't the adhesive on the weather stripping the weak link in this chain?
Or is it the acrylic sheet that this thing is made out of? And when he pulls a really heavy suction is getting bent and then unbent and then bent and then unbent. Acrylic's Achilles heel.
Yeah, and he does say that he cracked it. And, at the end of it, they're like, I don't know how many more uses we can get out of this. But for showmanship alone, I got to say the acrylic was a great choice. You should have just used a transparent sheet that was made of something else that would have held up to it. But it does look like 100 times cooler, don't you think?
Yeah, it does. And it's easy to machine. I mean, you do what you can with what you got on hand, right? And it worked for who knows how long.
Yeah, and the off-the-shelfness of this is just incredible. So you can go on AliExpress or eBay or wherever you want to go and buy vacuum pumps. So he buys a vacuum pump. I think I wrote down the specs for it. Let's see. It's a DC diaphragm pump. Okay, so he has an area that's 11 inches by 12 inches that he's trying to pull a vacuum on. And theoretically, he calculates he can pull 1,452 pounds of suction on that 11 by 12 surface. And so you see him climbing up walls, and these are like cement walls, and some of them are painted, and you can see where the paint is chipped off. So like some of them are unpainted, they're porous. Like there is a little bit of variability here. And he says that you have to either give the thing a good push to get the seal to start, or once you're climbing up the wall, putting a little weight on it will also seat the seal on the wall. The one thing that I wanted to see him try that I'm sure wouldn't work, he's next to a brick wall, and I wanted to see that weather stripping try to fill the gaps. The brick is uneven, it's got a lot of crevices in it, and then you also have the mortars usually kind of like concave.
If your pump can pull fast enough, I guess you can pull it off, right?
I would think so. I didn't look in our back catalog. I bet we've seen stuff like this before. Do you remember any of these?
I wouldn't be surprised at all, but I can't think of one off the top of my head.
I remember seeing a lot of robots that use them.
Yeah, exactly.
And they make little toy cars and stuff, and they'll just have like a fan. It's almost like a hovercraft in reverse, right? So there's a skirt, and it's like sucking the stuff out. Vacuum gloves for climbing buildings. Ooh. 2009. Awesome. That's a throwback, and yeah, I think probably the links for that are dead. So, who knows? I love this one though. Go check it out. It will make your weekend.
Next up, I have Dominik Zabluski, aka Phobos, with a super speedy, lightweight, lossless compression algorithm. And this is one of those things where you'd think, there's JPEG, there's PNG. Who in their right mind would make their own image compression algorithm? And the answer is somebody who is concerned about performance. And in particular, the algorithm that Dominik comes up with kind of trades off the absolutely highest compression ratio for kind of speed of computation and simplicity of the algorithm, which is really neat if you're doing embedded projects where maybe RAM is limited or CPU cycles are limited. And in fact, he says that he gets about a 50 times speed up versus PNG in terms of encoding and like 2 to 3 times in terms of decoding. It's really neat because it's just like compressing any other data. There's a little bit of an art to it, but there's also kind of 5 or 6, maybe 8 different ways you could possibly make a compression algorithm for images that's going to be lossless. And so he kind of trots out the usual suspects. So the way it works is he goes from one pixel to the next, and if the color's the same, it keeps track of how many in a row it sees of the same color. So if it's got like 5 light blue pixels in a row, it'll just say 1 light blue pixel and then 5, and the decoder will know to do that. If there is a color that it's seen before, each pixel has a serial number, or I guess the previous 64 pixels are numbered. And so if it uses a color that it's seen before, it just says, oh, that was color number 3. If that fails, it then takes the RGBA distance from the previous one and just uses the differences in each of the components, which is going to be less data than the whole thing. So if you're in a 8-bit by 8-bit by 8-bit color space, maybe he's got 2 bits for the differences. And then if it's outside of the differences in the end, he just stores the color data. So as a fallback, it is truly lossless if none of these compression tricks work. Like I said, it's simple enough that I could just now explain it to you in 3 minutes in a podcast. If you go look at the PNG spec, whoa,
Yeah.
prepare to sit down for like 6 days and wrap your head around it.
Yeah, I thought that was really cool as well, as this was the easiest compression to understand. Lossless compression, definitely. It's easy for me, when you talk about, okay, if you have a repeated pixel, you just say the pixels specifications one time, and then you say how many times it repeats. So that's just like run length encoding, right? One of the interesting discussions in his write-up is he said that like the difference between run length encoding and like the next type of compression is like this huge chasm that doesn't really have anything in between. And so his contribution to this is, when run length encoding isn't going to work for you,
right,
he's got those like 3 different approaches to keep the thing from ballooning out of control. And if you think about it, like you generally have color palettes, shades, that sort of thing that are pretty consistent throughout photos. So I'm sure you could specially design an image that's just going to be horrible to compress.
Yeah, exactly.
But for the most part, it's intuitively it feels like it's going to work really well.
The bit with differencing between colors that are similar to each other is just like in audio, there's this differential pulse code modulation where instead of recording every 16-bit volume level, you just record the changes from one to the other. And because sound waveforms are smooth, that makes for a very nice tight encoding. And the same thing's happening here, right? Because color changes tend to happen slowly. If it falls down to this third encoding algorithm, it should handle it pretty well. Along the way, I looked into a bunch of things. This is not his first image/video compression rodeo. He has looked into taking on MPEG before, and that's actually what inspired him to get into the lossless image compression game. And along the way, he lists an interesting library of image manipulation functions that will also be useful for kind of limited systems. It's the STB image library. They're really cool, and it's similar in spirit to this image compression decompression algorithm. The weirdest thing about it is that these are all written as single header files. So it's one .h file that compiles in C, and that's the whole thing. It's not a library, it's not anything. And apparently this is some kind of weird Windows thing where if you have trouble specifying your header file path, you could get around it by just shoving the code and the header all in one file, labeling it .h. And it's a complete abomination, but it forces the coders to write nice, tight, compact, and readable code. So the byproduct for us is that it's a really neat library, and you should check it out if you're doing image manipulation.
We got to talk about this Magnus effect boat, Elliot.
Heck
so
yeah.
I think the last time we talked about James Wamsley was the Magnus effect plane, which instead of having a propeller, it has like 2 long cylinders that are parallel to the ground, perpendicular to the direction of flight. And they kind of they spin and pull the plane through the air. So this is similar. It's a catamaran boat, which means it's just got like 2 pontoons instead of one hull. And then sticking up where the mast would be on a sailboat is a cylinder. And then the cylinder is spun up with a motor. And so the way the Magnus effect works is one of the edges is moving air backwards in relation to the boat. And so the friction of the cylinder is pushing on the air molecules. And because of the equal and opposite reaction laws of physics, the air molecules are then also pushing in the opposite direction on that side of the cylinder. And since that cylinder is attached to the boat and the boat is floating on water, not anchored, it makes the boat want to move. And so you can actually drive this little boat around the lake with nothing but a smooth cylinder, sticking upright, rotating at a high speed.
The way this works is exactly like the way you make a soccer ball or a baseball curve, right? It's spinning, so it wants to be pulled in one direction. This is, instead, you're spinning the rotor, stationary relative to the boat, and then you've got wind coming across it, and that makes it want to curve, i.e. push it through the water. It's really crazy, and the fact that he can make this work is really, really awesome and completely random.
I guess the keel, the long surface area of the boat keeps it from turning, but he's got a rudder. So once the thing gets moving forward, he can use the rudder for some level of steering. It's not a perfect example, but I kind of like bringing up the not perfect examples because you could totally take a boat that you already own and retrofit it in an afternoon and go play with the idea, and you should.
All right, my last hack of the week is a demo scene helper / retrocomputer extravaganza. Nicholas Gröneboom has Turbo Rascal is the Retro Pascal compiler we always wanted. First, it's a Pascal compiler that compiles for essentially every retrocomputer target you could think of. Commodore 64 is heavily targeted because that was, I think, Nicholas's nostalgic computer love. But then there's Amiga 500, BBC Micro, old school IBM PC, Atari ST, Game Boy, Amstrad, NES, ZX Spectrum, Apple II, you name it. Like, this thing cross-compiles to basically every retro computer out there, and it's got a built-in emulator for it. And what's really super awesome about this project is that it's not just a programming language and compiler, it's the complete development environment for making cool old school demos on these retro computers. So it comes with an IDE to which he's added a really nice code completion feature and like an image editor, so you can quickly change the pixelization and reverse colors and convert images into the specific file formats that all of these weird old computers need. It's got a built-in ray tracer. It's got a built-in tracker, so you can do the soundtrack in the same environment. And then, of course, because it runs these things emulated before it does the compilation, you can test it out on a virtual version of the computer. So it makes for this just absolutely beautiful, everything all under one hat kind of retro demo scene, old computer programming environment.
Now, even if you're not interested in the compiler itself, it's worth coming and looking at the promo video for this because it takes what I think is the same demo, just compiled for like a ton of different things. And it's really cool to see like the different graphic styles and capabilities of the machines. But Elliot, listening to the audio, switch from each system, from system to system. And it's like, sometimes like you smell something and it like sparks memories. Like
Yep.
it's all chiptune-y stuff, but like if you know any of these retro consoles, like it's immediately recognizable based on just the tone and the voice of the audio being played.
And I guess I said demo scene stuff because I think that's where Nicholas is coming from. But this is also going to be a phenomenal editor for making games for all of these platforms. And I think that's where this could really shine, is that this kind of creates a write it once, compile it for all these different targets. I think there's some porting involved because some of the low-level hardware stuff won't work the same, of course. But it makes it really significantly easier to conceive of writing a game that you could run on an Atari and a Game Boy, which is just mind-blowingly cool. This sort of power, of course, without good documentation would be daunting. Don't worry about that. On the website, there's about 40 example projects. There's a phenomenal video tutorial series where he just kind of goes and does 3 to 5 minute live coding things that then come out with a nice demo at the end. That gives you a flavor for how the coding would work for all the different computers. If that's not enough, there's one more computer that this compiles for, and that's the OK64, which is a virtual computer, a fantasy old school computer that has like a 6502 and a SID chip and some other memory and stuff. So not only does this compile your game/demo code for a million old retro computers, it also compiles it for at least one that doesn't exist.
My first quick hack this week is about analyzing Starlink data. So Christian Hahn did a really great compilation of early work in exploring what kind of information you can get from Starlink using an SDR and some other equipment. To go along with that is my second quick hack this week. Derek has been looking at using an SDR just to listen for the different tracking beacons on the Starlink. So instead of, figuring out what data is being sent down, you can just track which piece of hardware is overhead right now. And my last quick hack of the week, vision impaired electronics engineer shows the way to get things done. Ryan Flowers picked up on this article. It's a forum post by Ergon, who has visual impairment. I believe he's blind in one eye and has glaucoma in the other one, but it doesn't stop him from laying down the surface mount components, doing the soldering. I even liked it, Elliot, that he's throwing shade against KiCad and Eagle because he likes to use dip trace. But the point of it is that we could do a lot of things. We just need to find the tools and the methods that allow us to do them. And I really liked his story. Go check it out.
I'm going to sneak in 4 quick hacks this week by doing it even quicker. First off is Handy Gung. Recycled parts round out soap-shaped electric car. The last video of his we featured was a barbecue piano on wheels that rotated skewers when you tickled the ivories. This one is a 4-wheel drive vehicle where all of the wheels turn at the same time so it can drive in any arbitrary direction. It's a lovely hack made up of busted electric scooters he picked up at the dump. Next up, Thomas Sen Ladderer asks the question, do you really need to dry 3D printer filament? And the answer is no. He leaves filament inside, outside, and in a bucket of water and tries to measure the weight gain on the different filaments, gets nothing. Prints them out, he gets some more stringing and maybe some surface finish issues with the wetter stuff, but finds no strength or durability difference at all. If you're only into functional prints, don't worry about drying out your filament. Pierre Muth giving flip dots the oil treatment to shut them up. Mike, you wrote this one up. It is
That's me.
Pierre basically submerges a bunch of flip dots in mineral oil to keep them quiet, but the side effect is that in the viscosity, they turn extra slowly, and it makes this just fantastically lovely effect. A from the French mistranslation led people to think that the oil in this is something other than mineral oil, but Pierre comes in the comments and clears it up. It's just mineral oil, folks. Last up, Feel Free / Philip. Want Octoprint but lack a Raspberry Pi? Use an old Android phone. This is brilliant. It is a port of the fantastic 3D printer wrangler Octoprint to work on old Android phones, and it works on phones from kind of 5 or 6 years ago. So if you've got an old phone or you're willing to pick one up on eBay, and you have a USB OTG cable, you can load this APK on there, and you've got a little computer that has a screen, it's got a camera, it's got Wi-Fi, it's got everything you need to run Octoprint and make a beautiful printer server, and you're keeping junk out of the waste stream. This is like the coolest old cell phone hack I've seen to date.
Now it's time for our Can't Miss Articles of the Week. This is the long-form content written by brilliant Hackaday writers. And this week I chose one by Matthew Carlson. He wrote, "What's the deal with UEFI?" Elliot, were you a UEFI expert before this?
I was not. I've never gotten to do what I need, so I've always avoided it.
Yeah, so I've seen it when you boot up a laptop. I've seen it say like UEFI enabled, or you can like turn it off. I had someone ask me, "Hey, I'm putting a new version of Linux on this computer. Do you know anything about UEFI?" And I'm like, "No, I don't." And so we looked around, and of course, Matthew has a strong background in it, and having come from writing firmware for computers, and really did a great dive into this. So the UEFI stands for Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, and I think the easiest way to explain it is it's like a next generation standard to replace BIOS. And I think of BIOS as something that lives on an EEPROM chip on your motherboard. When you first turn on the computer, the hardware goes and gets its instructions on how to start its life from that chip. Problem is that you're kind of limited in what you can do with that. I think that there weren't a lot of standards on BIOS, and the UEFI is trying to make things easier for like OS manufacturers, so that when you get to the point where the OS is going to wake up and loaded kernels start to come to life, there's kind of an even playing field, and like all the signposts are in the right place and the roads go where people would expect them to go. And it's getting to that point that is what UEFI accomplishes.
But that's exactly what's wrong with UEFI, is that what it's doing is basically providing an operating system that then the operating systems can use, right? And the beauty of BIOS is that it really didn't do anything more than like stand up the hard drives and say, okay, we're going to start running code at this sector, right? BIOS is awesome because it's so minimal. There's almost nothing that can go wrong. Whereas UEFI is significantly bigger. It makes all these other interfaces. It really is running a little kind of not necessarily entirely transparent operating system.
Oh, not at all transparent. Yeah.
That has like super root on your computer because it boots up before your operating system boots up. So if there's something wrong with it, of course, it's got you by the short and curlies. There are examples of people who've had issues with UEFI BIOSes. I guess that's a contradiction in terms. With UEFIs that prevent them from running operating systems other than the ones that are signed and it's supposed to accept. That's where it rubs some Linux people the wrong way, is that it's kind of a proto operating system that won't let you do what you want to do with your hardware sometimes. Not all UEFIs are like that, though.
Right. And I got to say, I have bias against UEFI because that's how they're in my consciousness, as this being a bad thing that prevents, like open software from running. But I didn't have any deeper of knowledge than that. So it's not a good bias. I mean, the other bias I have, I think I've said it a couple times, that this is on laptops. And that's because I actually boot laptops frequently, but like my desktop computer, once you build it, you should never shut it off again. So
Right.
I bet this motherboard is, I think, from 2017, and I bet it has UEFI on it, and I've just have only rebooted it 10 times in its life, and so I just never see that message come up. Some of the danger zones that Matthew covers is that you can like actually hard brick a computer if you have a bad UEFI update. Now, you could always brick a BIOS update, but like I said before, usually there's like an 8-pin SOIC EEPROM on the board, and so if you have a little clamp or you don't mind lifting that chip off, they're pretty easy to reflash and get the computer going again. And I think, isn't that a tried and true thing with ThinkPads, Elliot? Like people would reflash the BIOS chips on those boards?
Yeah, if you want to do crazy boot things, you can do that,
Yeah.
right? Like that's core boot and etc.
EUFI is more like firmware burned to a chip, and that chip is protected so that shenanigans can't happen. And so if you have a bad update come through, like if the people doing the UEFI firmware update made a mistake in the firmware, you could potentially brick the board to the point that it just cannot. You'd have to replace the hardware, which is scary. So, but I don't think there's widespread examples of that, or at least I haven't heard of any of them. On the flip side, nobody's ever going to update their BIOS other than the computer geeks like us, right? Like when there's a BIOS update, your average computer user is never going to do it. And that's where I've seen firmware updates come through on the Dell laptop that I have that's running Linux Mint on it. And they come through automatically as like an apt update. And then when you reboot, they get installed. And I'm sure that's the UEFI updating the firmware, which I consider to be good because hopefully it's keeping it secure. But who would know?
The beauty about BIOS, though, is that it's so old and so small. Like, there's only so many bugs you can cram into 256 kilobytes, right?
Oh, challenge accepted.
And over the last 40 years, they've all been basically kicked out, right? Like, so, I don't know. It's this... There's always these questions when you're designing complicated systems of where you draw these kind of boundaries. And the BIOS one was made so long ago that the decision is just enough to stand up the hard drives and get some code running. There's all sorts of cool things you can do if you're willing to do more ahead of time, but that's kind of taking away the operating system from the operating system in a way. I don't know.
Now, other than the drill down in all this BIOS UEFI stuff, it is interesting to just walk through. Matthew outlines the route that an x86 chip takes in booting. It talks about like each stage of it, and that is fascinating. He gets into interesting things like if you have a chip that has multiple cores, there's actually a race to see which core will boot first. And then the one that boots first is the king during the rest of the boot sequence, which is kind of interesting. He also talks about how high-speed RAM has to be characterized at boot time in order for it to work correctly. And over time, the performance of the high-speed RAM will change, and so it has to be recharacterized. So even if you cache some of that performance characteristics for use, on a future reboot, it will need to be, worked out again, which, Elliot, makes me wonder if I should actually reboot my battle station once in a while.
A reboot and a reinstall keeps something.
Yeah, I rebooted it before Remoticon just to make sure that if there is anything. And I was like, well, wait a minute. What if I reboot it and it doesn't come back on again?
I tell you what, that is almost as dangerous as standing up a whole new computer to do audio and video for Remoticon.
Oh, yeah. I wonder who would do something silly like that.
Only someone who really had confidence in Arch Linux.
I've just thought of a story. My first job in high school was working at an internet service provider, and that's where I first was exposed to Linux. But I think that they were actually running a Windows NT machine. This was like mid-90s. And the Windows NT machine was doing like all of the logins for everyone that was dialing in to the ISP. And I was the only one there. I was doing like customer service or something. And one of the engineers called in and said, hey, I need you to go and reboot this machine. I'll tell you how to do it. So I took like the long phone cord, because I had to take the phone with me into the server room, right? Because phones were attached to walls back then. The long phone cord, and I'm in there, and I'm standing up at this rack, and I'm typing in these commands. And it goes down and it boots up again, and it won't boot because someone had not renewed the license. And so it wanted us to put in the license key. And this is like the weekend or something. And then all of a sudden, all of the customer service lines start ringing because when we rebooted it, it booted everyone off, and then no one can dial in again.
Lovely.
So be careful when you reboot your machines that you never reboot.
Yeah, right? Who knows what dragons are buried? My can't miss story this week is Prusa XL goes big, but that's only half the story. This is a kind of review by Tom Nardi of the not yet released Prusa XL printer and what we know about it. Prusa's been in the rep-rap scene for a long time and making their own printers for quite a while as well. And they tend to be well-made machines that are they're a little bit expensive, but they get all of the details right. And this is an upcoming machine that's actually a lot expensive, and it's huge. So they'd better be getting all of the details right. But if there's anyone who can hammer this, I bet it's Joe Prusa and team. This machine is a Core XY, which for those of you who aren't familiar with 3D printers, normal Cartesian 3D printers are set up so that the bed, the y-axis, comes out at you and holds the print on it, while another axis, the x, goes up and down and over it to print. Core XYs instead have an XY movement, so the print head moves like it was a normal printer, and then a bed that slowly sinks down as the plastic gets extruded into the shape you want. Most Core XY machines are built in kind of a cube shape. This one instead looks like a big C shape. And the reason for that is that it's a lot easier to get your hands in and get the print off. And any of you who have worked with a Core XY or one of these other cube shaped machines knows that those two front pillars are always in your way when you want to get anything off. That's a really sweet design here. The size of this thing is 360 millimeters in every direction. It's got optional tool changer. It's got a multi-part printed bed. So you have a really big printing bed. The nice thing is it's got 16 zones, so you don't have to fire them all up at the same time, and it probably also reduces warping. It's got a custom 32-bit controller. It's got a brand new extruder design, which looks really cool. It's got a cycloidal drive and a really big gear that pushes the filament through. And this is in contrast to a lot of the other ones that have really tiny little gears. I think the diameter on mine is something like 8 millimeters. It's under a centimeter. And this one is like 2.5, 3 centimeters. It's gigantic. And what that means is it's a lot less likely to strip the filament and chew it up as it's pushing it through. Made possible by a cycloidal drive, which is just sexy looking, frankly. And Joe himself says that a huge portion of the price of this machine is sunk into the high quality linear rails that they use. And they're not using the cheap Chinese linear rails. They got the good stuff and the good belts and everything else. In my opinion, it's the right size for a big machine. It's big, but it's not too huge. It's got all the convenience factors you'd want. What's the downside? And I have to say the downside is it's going to cost about $2,000.
I mean, that's not bad considering the increased build size. I mean, you should use the right size tool for your job, right?
Yep.
You don't use the world's biggest wrench to turn the screws, I don't know, on your glasses case. You don't use the world's biggest screwdriver. What if you look at the promotional picture of this, there's like an accordion material kind of like on pinhole cameras. Is that like a modesty shield? Is that like the temperature enclosure or something?
That's a really clever little bit of design. It's actually kind of a weird little compromise. It lifts up to close off this essentially open C part. Joe calls it a draft shield. It doesn't turn it into an enclosed 3D printer, but it'll definitely keep wind from blowing in on the side and affecting the temperature of the nozzle and your print as it's going along. For some filaments, this sort of thermal control of the environment that it's being printed in is really key. And this may not do as well as a fully enclosed printer, but it's so cute and so small and easy. It doesn't add anything to the footprint of the printer, and it probably gets the job like 80% done. In that sense, I think it's actually super duper clever.
I want to see some like assembly automation done with this. So if it's got tool changers and you could put multiple tool heads on it, could you have like a gripper mechanism that could pick up like a reinforcing shape and, you know, pause the print, put the reinforcing metal shape in, continue the print? Or, you know, they have those auto-feeding screwdrivers for manufacturing. Like, what was that lamp? That we published one about a lamp this week, and it was all 3D printed except for like 250 screws or something in it. Like, like you could just imagine if you're going along and having some like advanced assembly automation that was happening with this. I think that feels very much like a future tech thing.
We're totally going too far into the future here, but you know what you just made me think of was how you often want to put in those melt-in screw thread holder things. What are they called?
Bosses, yeah.
Those melt-in, screw bosses, screw nuts.
Inserts, threaded inserts.
Threaded inserts. You could like jury rig up some horrible old, you know, soldering iron that you don't care about anymore, then just have it switch over to that head and drop them in.
You know, that's interesting because one of the problems with those threaded inserts is that you get them too hot, or you put them in at an angle, or you push them in too far. It's like repeatability on that might be really valuable.
The last really cool feature of this is that there's an analog load cell on the print head itself. And so instead of tapping down on something magnetic or inductive or using conduction to figure out the Z height of the head above the bed, it's actually got a load cell, and so it feels the pressure. It goes down until it feels it hit the print bed. And that's really neat. A number of other printers do that. This one uses an analog load cell, so that is, it can tell not just am I pressing the bed, but how hard am I pressing the bed. And Prusa hints that they've used this for jam detection or filament underrun detection. So if the head notices that there's a sudden pressure change in how hard it's squishing the filament down, it can then take action. And they're doing a lot of logging on this. And he kind of teases in this interesting video with Joel, the 3D printing nerd, that I'll throw in the show notes, that they will be collecting a lot of this data and trying to use it to do not just jam detection, but also, like, in their own production fleet, figure out what it is that are the precursors to these jams and figure out if they can head them off at the pass. So it's kind of like a super duper quality control feature as well as just a Z height adjuster. And I think with a lot more of this kind of data and the kind of folks who are working at Prusa, they will probably push this forward to the next level.
That's all the time we have for this episode of the Hackaday podcast. As always, we'd love to hear from you. You can leave a comment on the show notes, which you'll find at hackaday.com/podcast. You can email us, editor@hackaday.com. We live and die by the tips that you send us, so if you do something cool or you see something cool, we'd love to hear about it. tips@hackaday.com. And until next time,
keep on hacking.
I'm just doing a fingertip clap because I'm wearing wrist warmers. Good luck finding files in my drive when I'm gone.
I mean, I can't find them in my own. There's no difference.
This build, which is a note on a different tab and I don't have... Meh.
No, that works.
Animating traces, smiling faces, spinning sails, and perfect nails.